How do you make Boston Public Schools great again? After a series of unpopular reform proposals, some parents think it's time to discuss giving power back to the people. Right now, the 7-member school committee charged with overseeing the network of 125 schools is appointed by Boston Mayor Marty Walsh. But some say it might be time to let the voters have a say once again. For the record, the Boston School Committee used to be an entirely elected body, but the city did away with that system nearly 30 years ago. I'm joined now by at-large City Councilor Anissa Essaibi-George, a former Boston school teacher who chairs the city's Committee on Education, Peter Kadzis, senior editor at WGBH and my collaborator on WGBH's politics podcast, The Scrum, and Jane Miller, a Boston Public Schools parent who recently helped reignite this conversation when she asked other parents to weigh in on social media. Thank you all for being here. Councilor, let me start with you. Why are you filing a motion to hold this hearing, or request to hold this hearing at this point in time?
Well, let me first say thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing us to continue this conversation. It's actually why I'm calling for this hearing order. I think it's incredibly important that the families of Boston and the parents and families of our kids that attend the Boston Public Schools, or who might attend the Boston Public Schools someday, have a seat at the table and have an opportunity to talk about this in a very public forum. It is my job, and I'm very proud to serve as the chair of the Committee on Education, especially as a former BPS teacher and a parent of BPS kids, to lead this conversation, to talk about what's best for our city and to talk about really what's best for our kids. Is it elected, appointed, a hybrid combination of those things? We need to have that conversation in the public space.
I know correlation isn't causation, but would you have made a push for this hearing if we hadn't just had this big blow up around school start times and end times, or did that play a role?
I'd say it played a role. This has been a conversation item for a number of years. We've talked about this in my time, my 2 years, just over 2 years now on the City Council. It's been a conversation. It has been something that the communities at large have talked about for a number of years before I was elected to the body, and probably since we switched from an elected school committee to an appointed. What is best for the city of Boston? The bell time fiasco, the bell time mess, I think brought this conversation back to the forefront. And as chair, I'm proud to call this hearing and host this discussion for the city of Boston.
Jane Miller, you played a role in building the momentum that seems to be at play here. What was it that led you to conduct this, I think unscientific, but not necessarily uninformative poll on Facebook and Twitter, sizing up how parents feel about the school committee?
We had met because of start times. We had about 150 parents at Doyle's one night, and that was with 24 hours notice. And one of the things that kept getting thrown out was an elected school committee. It hadn't been anything on my mind or my partner Erin's mind at the time. But as time went on, people kept emailing us and calling us, and they felt that there was a lack of independence and that the school committee had become a rubber stamp. That there was certainly a lack of transparency, which was again supported when the recent school committee appointments were made. And that
You told me when we were chatting earlier that to find out who the new school committee appointees were, you had to initiate contact with the city, right?
To find out who the nominees were.
Nominees, okay.
I had to email the nominating panel because they hadn't updated their site in a year. So I reached out and asked who the candidates were and who their nominees were. And of course, the nominees included Harding and Lecanto, who were then appointed. But nothing was done publicly. There was no input from BPS families and caregivers, and it didn't feel transparent.
So the polling that you did on social media, what did you find when it comes to how people feel about this? What do people want?
So 93% of respondents want some form of an elected committee. So either hybrid, elected, they want to have their voices heard.
And hybrid would be partial appointed,
yep.
Partial elected. Okay. Peter Kadzis, you are a BPS parent. You've covered the Boston public schools a lot over the years. You also witnessed what I know you've referred to elsewhere as the bad old days of an elected school committee firsthand. What made, for people who don't remember that or weren't here, what made those bad old days bad?
Well, guys like Gerald O'Leary, who also lived down the street from me in Dorchester, siphoning off $650,000 that didn't belong to him, and
Oh.
the feds nabbed him. I mean, that's
pretty bad.
That's a really good example. Another was Paul Ellison, who operated more subtly, smaller time. He put in fake pay slips for an employee who didn't exist and kept the money. Then there were racists like Pixie Palladino and John Kerrigan. So the bad old days were really pretty bad. There was an interim period after that. And by the way, there have been good people on an elected school committee. John Nucci, for example, John O'Brien. I'm just naming two people. It's easy to exaggerate. Well, it's impossible to imagine how bad the bad old days were. But even in the bad old days, there were a few good people.
So just briefly, and I want to get the counselor back in here. When you hear her talking about maybe heading back in that direction, not necessarily, do you feel like, oh no, that would be a terrible mistake, or are those days gone?
A few years ago, I would have said that. But I'll tell you, Mayor Menino and Mayor Walsh, I think, have... you had the bad old days when there were crooks and racists, or then just political fixes. Now you've got rubber stamps. The two ladies were very kind in not using that word. But it's an inside ball game. No one dissents. And both Mayor Menino, the late Mayor Menino, and Mayor Walsh, they don't allow these people any latitude. If they did, we might not be facing this.
Councillor, hop back in.
Well, I will say that, well, first I'd like to say is that the appointed school committee now doesn't consist of bad people. These are very well-intentioned individuals who do care about our kids and about our school district. But it does we do beg the question, and I think part of this hearing order is part of that begging, what is best for our families and our kids? And it could remain an appointed school committee that does have a much more transparent process. We just went through it on the City Council with the Community Preservation Committee, an incredibly transparent process where every applicant from day one was available online. We knew who the applicants were. The interview process for an appointed committee was done in the public realm, all out for all to see. And I think that process that we just went through with the CPC could be something to discuss as part of this process.
It'd be a really heavy lift, right, procedurally, if people on the council decide, okay, yeah, we want to change it and we want to go to set up X, what would have to happen? Council would have to vote. The mayor would have to either approve or veto and be overridden. Am I right there?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And then we'd have to submit a home rule petition that would have to then go to the State House.
That's right.
There is this, we're calling for this hearing order tomorrow and Wednesday before the full City Council. It'll then get assigned to committee. And then we'll start having the hearing process. And one thing that I've cautioned parents and interested parties that have reached out is, one, there's no public comment tomorrow, but all are certainly welcome for this presentation of this hearing order. But this is a process that will take some time and will require patience from our families and those interested parties.
Jane, I want to close with you. Forgive me, I can't remember if you tackled this before, but one argument that you hear from people who want to keep the status quo is, we've already voted on this. Were there a couple votes? Am I right about that?
Yep.
Okay. People in Boston have weighed in on this 2 times. They gave their answer. Let's stick with the answer that they gave. What's wrong with that argument?
The last vote was in 1996. I was in high school. A whole generation has passed. I believe that we're a different Boston than we were 25 years ago. And I think that it's not unreasonable to allow people in the city to have a voice, to have a say. And we might find out that people don't want an elected school committee, but if enough people are talking about it, I think it's fair that we have an open discussion.
All right, we got to leave it there. Jane Miller, Peter Kadzis, Anissa Sabi George, thank you all.